Going to some sex questions here.
Here we go.
And I don't expect you to have like the answers off the top. However, a lot of people ask me this. What is the average number of times, based on your research, that married people have sex? What is the average? And does it differ based on age and how long they've been married?
It does, actually, on both of those things. So we know the number, it's kind of a tough question to answer. So we know that as people age, sexual frequency decreases, it declines. Although, if you control for medication use, so part of the kind of classic trend you see, a decrease in sexual activity, part of that is driven by medication use. So we know that things like cardiovascular drugs, antidepressants, they all negatively impact your sexual behavior. They negatively impact sexual function. So frequency goes down. Also, in the duration of a relationship, we know that we often have a more passion in the start of a relationship, and you start to move more into a companionate phase, often between 18 and 36 months in. I think you know, but so well from so many people you've coached and helped with relationships, and I know that you help so many people with this, that a lot of people struggle at that point in a relationship where they start to see that transition, because it's you shift a little bit about that, away from the new energy and the passion into the long-term commitment.
Right.
A lot of people break up in that period because they say that's maybe what they didn't think they wanted in a relationship. So there's a lot of variation on sexual frequency. A lot of couples in North America, they're looking at somewhere between 1 and 3 times per week, especially once they're established. I think
1 to 3 times per week. And again, this, I understand that there's a lot of variation, but sort of a general idea, because I think there's some married couples I know that, well, we're married, we never have sex. So for them, it's once a month. I thought you were going to say once a month, actually not once a week.
Well, it depends on the demographic. So we work on a lot of samples that, maybe, like, let's say we're looking at samples without kids, or we're working on younger samples. So you're exactly right. So that's where it gets even more complicated. Suddenly when we put in those people with children, or those people with a medical condition, or those people with different work hours from their partner, you can often see sex is quite infrequent, maybe once a month. But what's interesting is there's an interesting nuance in the data. So you can ask people about their sexual frequency, and it doesn't exactly predict satisfaction with their sex life or relationship. Wonderful colleague by my colleague Amy Muse, a wonderful study by my colleague Amy Muse, who's actually here in Toronto, found that once you have sex about once a week, you kind of hit a glass ceiling. So having sex once a week is at a frequency has positive outcomes for relationships in terms of sexual satisfaction, relationship satisfaction. Once you go above that, there's no benefit to having it 2, 3, 5, 6 times a week.
There's no health benefits either?
No, or benefits for the relationship satisfaction.
But this is the scientist here.
Yeah.
I'm not really liking this data that you're talking about. Okay, so now, were you talking about a specific pool? Again, what sample are we talking about? Women over 40, men, people in relationships?
Yeah, this is people in long-term relationships.
Okay, what works for you?
There's no right answer for everyone, because it depends on how tired are you from kids? What is your work schedule like? What's your own interest in sexual activity? What is your own physiology? So there's not a good answer, because there's so much diversity in people's lives and what works for them. But data would suggest that people who are hitting about at least once a week tend to have pretty high relationship and sexual satisfaction. Honey,
we've met the quota. We met the quota this week. There's absolutely no benefit to doing it again, okay?
That's where it gets challenging, though, because then we say, how do we put this to work in our real lives?
Now, why do you feel, and maybe there's science behind this, maybe there's not, and I know you as a friend, why do you, and here's what a lot of my clients struggle with is, why do people have such a difficult time talking about their sexual needs, and their sexual insecurities? There are a lot of sexual insecurities. There's also, when you're in a new partnership, it's like, what do you do? How do you talk about that? Is there something in the brain? Is there something in our conditioning that prevents us from having this kind of conversation? And what advice would you have for those that are just terrified to have this conversation?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I think there's so many people who struggle with those conversations. One of our favorite findings on our COVID studies on the impact of the pandemic on people's romantic and sexual lives is we found that about 1 in 5 people from a multinational sample all over the world, about 1 in 5 tried something new in their sexual life during the pandemic. And a lot of that was people turning to their partners and asking about sexual fantasies for the first time.
Ooh.
So this idea...
So is that overall good?
I think that's overall good.
Okay.
So although
All right.
frequency did go down, sexual frequency went down, which maybe we could say is bad, but but I think it depends on the person and the reason and the... But the fact that, I think the worrisome part is it took a pandemic, it took being freaked out and locked up for so many of us to turn to our partners for the first time and say, hey, honey, is there something we never really talked about that might interest you, that you might want to try? In some ways, I think it's an indictment on the fact that we're not having those conversations that you just mentioned, because we struggle with them. We have a sense of stigma. We're worried about what to ask and what people might think about us when we ask it. But it turns out quite a lot of research has shown that having those open conversations about your sexual needs, your interests, your wants, actually can spark a lot of chemistry with your relationship and can be really good for both you and your partner and the dynamic you're trying to build together. But it can be hard for people. Sometimes it's religiosity, sometimes it's shame, sometimes it's fear. Whole host of reasons that people struggle. Most people today, they haven't had comprehensive sex education. They haven't learned how to talk about body parts or arousal and I think that's okay. I think that's an important point that we have to give people it's okay to not know the right words and to laugh or be uncomfortable. As long as you're sort of honestly trying to say, hey, you know what we know from decades of research, we know from all of our real relationships, sexuality is a part of our intimate lives. It's a part of healthy relationships. It's a part of relationships that last.
Yes.
And we sometimes struggle to figure that out. But if we're honestly going to try and have good relationships, if sex is a part of our lives, let's talk about it to try and make it fulfilling, to make it pleasurable, to make it consensual.
So communication around relationships, sexual relationships, what I need, what you need, how to pleasure, what you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
That is something that ultimately is beneficial for the relationship.
Yeah, there is a small subset of people that they're so uncomfortable that having those conversations, I think, probably can damage their relationships.
Sure.
Researchers are still trying to understand that group, that sometimes the stigma and the shame is so heavy.
They just can't have the conversation.
They can't, and I think sometimes we need to respect that there are some people that can't. But if you can get yourself to a place that you're comfortable with those conversations, a lot of evidence suggests it's good for you, good for your partner, good for your relationship in the long run.